Our first guest today is the CEO of the Purpose of the Corporation, Brian Gallant. Brian is a highly respected and dynamic Canadian leader who has served as the Premier of New Brunswick from 2014 to 2018. Brian is the CEO of the Canadian Centre for the Purpose of the Corporation and a senior advisor at Navigator. Brian is also a special advisor on innovation, cybersecurity, and law to the president of Ryerson University, and an entrepreneur in residence for DMZ, which is an incubator. In addition to his time as Premier, Brian has served New Brunswick as the Attorney General, the Minister responsible for innovation, and the Minister responsible for women's equality. He also served as the chair of the Council for the Federation. Prior to entering politics, Brian worked as a corporate commercial lawyer. He has university degrees in business and law, as well as a Master of Law from McGill University. The keynote conversation today is with me and my co-chair, Dr. Musio. And so, Brian, a very, very warm welcome to you.
Mona, Lawrence, thank you so much for the invitation. It's fantastic to be here with you.
Awesome.
We are delighted that you are here with us. And I want to, I'm going to kick it off, and I want to talk about this concept of social purpose or purpose for companies, and this concept of both kind of profit and purpose, and the alignment between public and private institutions, and really your views on the relationship you see of how important purpose is for businesses when it comes out, in crisis, in dark times, but also in more traditional times, perhaps. And wanted to get your sense on this concept of purpose. So, Brian, let's start there.
Honestly, Mona, after listening to you and Lawrence chat for a little bit, I'm not sure I have much to add. That was wonderful. You, I think, listed off many of the challenges, opportunities, and interesting concepts and trends with regards to the topic of the purpose of the corporation. So maybe to answer your question, I'll do a few things. First off, I know a lot of people listening are already thinking about these things, but for just in case somebody is listening that hasn't really thought of this, or maybe just to try to give a different angle of how we could have this discussion, I always like to do this. The idea of the purpose of the corporation is not something that's really new. It's a manifestation of a topic that has been happening probably for a century. We are asking ourselves, what is the role of business in society? That's essentially what this is all about. And it's had different manifestations, from corporate social responsibility, ESG, stakeholder capitalism, shared value, purpose of the corporation. All of these things are really, at the end of the day, the institution of business and all the different types of entities that go within it. How do we ensure that they are helping us increase the quality of life for humans across the planet? They're helping us tackle societal challenges. They're helping create economic growth and wealth and innovation and all this good stuff. So essentially, that's really what the topic is for anybody that might be wondering. And of course, again, like I said, a different angle of thinking about it. So I think the idea that it is really all about what is the role of this institution in society, then you're going to ask yourself, well, why do people focus so much on the corporation? And I think in there lies some answers to sort of the more general questions. So they focus, in my humble opinion, on the corporation because it probably is the entity within the private sector. It's probably one of the entities within all institutions that really have all of the concepts and trends that are difficult to sort of wrap our heads around embedded in them, right? They do create economic growth. They do create wealth. They create opportunities, innovation. They do many things that raises the quality of life of millions, if not billions of people. But at the same time, they also cause, maybe sometimes unintendedly, sometimes maybe they're aware, other challenges and other problems. And they obviously are not necessarily always helping the society in general. Some are helping address a specific problem, but maybe creating other problems and maybe exacerbating existing problems. So it really is, I think, one of the entities that people kind of focus on because it embeds all of these interesting sort of concepts.
And
Sort of
Brian,
answer the first question off the top. One of the things that was that, sorry?
No, I was just going to ask you to also explore where you think we're at on the journey. You mentioned it isn't new, but I would also say it's nowhere near achieved. So give us some of your perspectives too on where we are on that evolution.
Well, so I think you're absolutely right to say that. And you both covered this in sort of the intro. There's no question the pandemic has sort of intensified the conversation. It's sort of put in front of us practically what this all means because we've had such a global challenge that sort of shut everything down and really made it that we needed all institutions to play a role. And some stepped up in a big way, some maybe not as much. Some within different institutions did more than others. And I certainly think Lawrence and others who are historians will look back at this period to sort of analyze how that all went. So all that to say, no, it's not achieved. It's a journey. And frankly, will it ever really be achieved? It's one of those things that I think we have to have the attitude that we're always going to be trying to improve and trying to push things a little bit further. Now, where I see ourselves is the following. I do think that there are some major trends that people listening, the business community in our country and across the world, frankly, should be thinking about. So I think where we're lacking and people will say, we got to step up, the business community has to step up, is in the following ways. First off, I think you're going to see a huge push for businesses to focus on all stakeholders. Sincerely consider all stakeholders' interests when making decisions, not just when it's expedient, when it's possible, all the time, always thinking about our employees, our customers, the communities in which we operate, the environment as an interest as well, and any other stakeholders that could be important. The second trend that I think is really gaining steam, because obviously people want to see corporations and business do more, there's going to be a real effort to sort of adopt more concrete and fulsome measurements of the value that a corporation is bringing to society. And I think the third, probably the most important trend, again, you and Lawrence touched upon this, longer term thinking. That is an incredibly important piece of this. And I think there's going to be lots of pressure for businesses and corporations to not think only about the short term, but obviously think about what's best in the long term. And on that note, I'm going to make a bit of a prediction. At one point, I don't know when, but at one point, there's going to be some case law, I'm convinced of it, where corporate directors are going to get in trouble because they would have made decisions that, yes, maybe was good for the organization or for some stakeholders in the short term, but was not what was best for the organization and even the stakeholders in the long term. And they're going to get into hot water because they have obviously a duty to the organization. And the last point I'll make, the last trend that I think is really sort of demonstrating where we're at on the journey, well, everybody wants to see all institutions step up to do more when it comes to tackling societal challenges. And frankly, I think there's more to be done there. Businesses need to understand and recognize that it's not just about the financials, the margins, the profits. It's also about what impact you're having on society and planet.
Yeah. I really like the exploration where you started on measurement. In our world, I'm seeing that really play out on diversity, equity, and inclusion, on climate, as just some very concrete examples of the transparency, the desire to set goals, and really be held accountable around progress towards those goals, both increasingly from a governance standpoint, as you think about embedding it within executive pay constructs, strategic goals for the corporation and for senior leaders in the corporation, but also extreme transparency in terms of showing the progress to a variety of stakeholders that then yields a different reaction in terms of their views on progress and pace towards those kinds of objectives. I want to also explore with you, you have such a rich background in the public sector. And so as you think about this concept of how the public sector and the corporation work together in many of these aspects that we've talked about in terms of societal problems, but also on the concepts of resilience. And, I mentioned two examples in terms of the financial crisis, or more recently in terms of the pandemic, where there's no doubt it was around full ecosystems, and it really took the complete partnership across some areas that worked well, some areas that didn't work so well at all. Give me your perspectives just on kind of as you think about the players that are important as we think about the journey ahead.
Well, it's fascinating. The sort of roles of business and government is really sort of blurring at the moment, and it'll be interesting to see where it all lands, if you will. But obviously, I won't belabor this. I think everybody can sort of do the math. But at the end of the day, I mean, originally the way it was sort of set up is government is supposed to think about social and societal issues, while the business institution is supposed to create wealth and economic growth. That was the demarcation. But now the lines are completely blurred in the eyes of the public, in my humble opinion. And we would certainly have research at the Canadian Centre for the Purpose of the Corporation that demonstrates this. And what's interesting is that when we survey Canadians, they'll say, yeah, government is responsible, is mostly responsible, if you will, for the tackling of societal challenges like climate change, inequalities, inequities, social cohesion challenges, all that stuff. But within the responsibility that they have to tackle those issues, we want them, Canadians would be saying this, to force businesses and corporations to help tackle them. So 2/3 of Canadians surveyed this year said that they believe businesses and corporations will need to be forced through taxes, regulations, and laws in order for us to overcome climate change, overcome inequalities and inequities. So there's a clear appetite for governments to sort of intervene and really force the hand of business. Now, interestingly, at the same time, there's a whole new openness for businesses to step up and speak out on societal issues and basically force the hand of governments to step up and do different things to tackle some of these social and societal issues. So it's really, when you think about it, quite fascinating that the public is essentially saying, well, we want probably the two of the most important institutions in our society. We want you to be keeping each other in check. It may be coming from sort of a really conniving strategic point of view, or maybe coming from the fact that they're sort of ambivalent of who tackles these societal challenges, or it might just be that they really practically recognize that both institutions need to sort of push each other. Either way, that's the appetite of Canadians at the moment. So the dynamic between the two and the blurring of the lines, I think, is going to continue in the months and years to come. The pandemic, again, has blurred those lines. Which obviously we can get into, but I'm sure most people can sort of calculate as to why that happened. And the only thing, though, that I would add is one dynamic that does worry me personally. It's the idea that on the speaking out, that businesses can sort of now say, if a government doesn't do X, Y, Z, and usually X, Y, Z is something that would be seen to be socially regressive. If a government doesn't do X, Y, Z, or reverse X, Y, Z, I should say, sorry, then we're going to take the following action. We may leave the state. We may, do whatever else that could have an impact, trying to force the hand of government to not take this regressive action, usually on a social policy. Well, so when I'm sitting there as an individual, I'm kind of supportive of that. I'm like, oh yeah, well, that's good, right? The business is speaking out for its values and the values of its stakeholders, and frankly, to what I think is right. But where I get a little nervous is when I sort of take that philosophical and theoretical argument, and then I say, well, what's going to happen when a business does the same thing, but for something that I don't think is right, for something that is regressive, that they're actually pushing for something that is maybe progressive to be repealed, or something that is regressive to move forward. So it's a really interesting time we live in. If I were to guess, and I say this humbly because Lawrence certainly with your experience would be able to help us with this. But I would essentially think that we're on a journey, as you mentioned, Mona, where we're all trying to figure this out. And the dust hasn't really settled, and we're not exactly 100% sure where the demarcation is supposed to happen. And we're going to be doing a bit of trial and error. But the one thing that is certain, people are asking for change, and that change includes businesses and corporations stepping up on societal and social issues.
Yes, and you're right, Brian. Lawrence coaches me often that it's hard to write history when you're in the battle or in the moment. It takes perspective, which is impossible to have when you're living it. I really like the concepts you've introduced here about trust, where societal trust is placed, and you mentioned some of the survey information. We've talked, I believe, at our other conference about the trust in corporations right now and the obligation that creates. You've also talked about government as intervener, maybe catalyst on various things. And when I think about the vaccine mandate issue right now, there's a very specific example of acting in that catalytic way, but then also what's created sometimes in terms of standoffs. And again, pulling through that example of vaccine mandate, that's what we're seeing play out in Texas a bit right now. And so I also think these elements of trust and what's desired from, and you mentioned Canadian population, is being shaped by generational changes and choices, and how people are thinking about brands, the importance of those brands, and their views on these important societal issues, and how that translates into choices people make around buying, or choices that people make around employment decisions, or as we're seeing with climate, around where they allocate their capital in terms of asking different questions. Now, Lawrence, I want to bring you into the conversation with us, and I know you also have a number of questions for Brian. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Mona, and thank you, Brian, for joining us here. Your remarks are really interesting. There are so many things that we could unpack, and I guess we'll just get to them, right? I think one of the things that you mentioned, I think you're focusing on the relationship between the state and enterprise, and I think that you've got a very interesting and incisive point of view on that. Not only from an observer status, you were actually a participant and a protagonist in those things, and especially your comments, very welcome comments about what we're trying to figure this out, that is kind of fluid, right? And so let me come back to that kind of more, say, I wouldn't say a political question, but it's one of the kind of potential practical dangers that of the purpose movement within institutions, and especially larger ones, is that they sometimes can become embroiled, as you both have said, in certain questions that they're maybe not always, say, well equipped to handle. So the decision to move, say, into the public square, which they're kind of being pushed and pulled into in some ways, right? Maybe to have opinions in a divided polity, right? Might that not trigger the law of unintended consequences in societies, especially that are effectively kind of politically polarized, right? So so I think sometimes a concern that many people have is that the clear blue water that often separated, at least nominally separated, the institutions and business will disappear. I mean, there's always been elite accommodation, and there have been a necessity, especially during times of emergency, to band together. And here, what am I thinking of? I'm thinking of wartime. I'm thinking of national emergency, depression, and so forth. But in this particular instance, I wonder whether corporations might not be susceptible to, say, certain kind of pressure to support one policy or the other, which you're mentioning. So I'd like to maybe get into that a little bit, especially if that policy is popular, like you yourself said. So it's kind of a reverse kind of capture thesis. But what maybe we can talk a little bit more about that, because I think you would have a really really interesting perspective on that.
Well, thank you so much to unpack there. So let me do the best that I can. So first off, you both sort of alluded to the idea of the impact of politics and different layers of that, which would include different generations, different priorities, and all that good stuff. So first off, let me just comment on generations. One argument that I try to use when I'm talking to a business or corporation and trying to get them to think about their purpose, think about living their purpose, being more stakeholder centric, all that good stuff, I usually say, I think it's the right thing to do. But if that doesn't work for you, then we have younger generations that are, like Mona said, going to increasingly communicate their values, their opinions on you and what you do and the impact you have through the way they vote, through who they purchase from, and who they work for. So even if you do not think it's necessarily the right thing to do, if you have the argument of that's not what a corporation is for, or my business is for, whatever it might be, I would still submit to you that at the end of the day, you're going to want to start to future prep. You're going to want to start to think about where younger generations are going, what they're going to create, and what impact that will have on you. And if you do that, I'm quite convinced that you'll start to future prep now. You'll start to think about, how can I be more purpose driven? How can I be more stakeholder centric? How can I help create a capitalist economic system that is modernized, more sustainable, fairer, equitable, inclusive? So I'm convinced of that. The other aspect that I find fascinating is people, and this is something I've lived from different angles and perspectives. People often say, well, governments do this and governments do that. Political parties say this and they say that. Well, at the end of the day, governments and politicians represent people. They don't necessarily represent the point of view of 100% of a jurisdiction. Frankly, nobody probably ever does, but they represent at least a percentage of the populace's opinions. So at the end of the day, if a government, a political party is doing something, saying something, it's most likely because there are people that think that way or that have that opinion. And I only say that because it's important to keep an eye on, and I think for any organization to have a sense of the opinion and the sentiments of the populace. And here in Canada, we're doing that at the CCPC, and I can tell you that they want a modernized capitalist system. So it's interesting because only 16% of Canadians surveyed said, yeah, we think that the capitalist system has to be completely replaced. Only 16% said that. Only 25% said the status quo is okay and capitalism, not perfect, but the way that it works right now, let's continue. 59% of Canadians said they want it modernized to be more sustainable, more equitable, more inclusive. And at the same time, we have employees putting on pressure for organizations. So it's not just, these people aren't just putting pressure on governments and political parties to step up and say things and try to get business and corporations to sort of get active on these societal questions. They're also, like we mentioned, they're speaking through who they work for. And they communicate when they're deciding who to work for, but also once they take a job, they at times will very much express their values, their concerns, their issues, their suggestions. And we have a survey as well that demonstrates that a large portion of Canadians are actually thinking of changing their job over the next year, 42%, if I'm not mistaken, in that ballpark. And there's been research done for other jurisdictions with similar numbers. And the number one reason people said that they're thinking of changing their job is because they believe their employer puts profit over people. The next bucket of reasons is because there's not enough work-life balance. And the third bucket is there's not enough diversity and inclusion. So essentially, the business is not representing the values that I hold dear. So this is yet another way in which Canadians, and I would argue people across the globe, are putting and applying pressure for an institution like business to step up. And then the last point I'll make, because I sort of wanted to try to unpack a lot of the things that you said there, which was great.
That was a lot.
Yeah, no, and it's fantastic, and obviously demonstrates the multifaceted and holistic discussion that this is. But what I find really interesting, Mona, again, you alluded to this. We have collaboration between business and government often. There's lots of collaboration that happens that people don't necessarily see. We obviously see that collaboration be enhanced in times of needs and times of crisis. I would simply submit that we really got to step up as a society and just do that a lot more, and do it pre extreme event, pre crisis, and start to really pinpoint the challenges that we know are bubbling and that we know are creating some of these extreme events, and collaborate to address them now. And right now, on the minds of Canadians, Mona, you mentioned it at the top: climate change, inequalities, inequities, systemic racism, Indigenous reconciliation. These are all things important to Canadians, and governments have a huge role to play. But as I already mentioned, Canadians also want governments to force businesses to play that role. And then at the same time, they want businesses to keep governments in check and speak out if they're not doing enough.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Brian. Yeah, I do think that that the situation is in very much in flux, and I think I very much take your point about how there needs to be more collaboration, right? There needs to be more, let's say, more discussions vis-a-vis the grand challenges, right? And if you really think about it in the long run, perhaps maybe apolitical corporate leadership is maybe more of a recent blip in time, because we're maybe returning to a period. I'm not talking about partisan politics. I'm talking about more like public policy, that where corporations are maybe more expressing their views on, on different on issues of the day. And so if you kind of roll back the tape, perhaps it's more classically, let's say, financial institutions would maybe comment on economic policy, right? Now maybe the aperture is a little bit wider, these days, because the problems seem to be more in Mona's terms, more wicked, right? And so there is perhaps a, let's say, maybe the public has got it right in some ways, because they want countervailing institutions, right? So that Galbraithian idea of the state versus the state kind of keeping corporations in check, and corporations kind of helping out, circumscribing the let's say government overreach, and so it is a really it is a really interesting time, because if you think of corporations, I mean, think of yes, you can think of big and powerful banks, but you also think of big pharma. You think of social media giants, and so forth. So I suppose that or oil companies, etc. So and I think especially in the last couple of years that there's been a let's say a reevaluation of what the roles are and what maybe some of the outcomes are, and I'm talking especially about about big tech. And so maybe the allure of massive kind of, or state, re-regulation or state expansion, maybe kind of in this area can be too tempting for politicians to resist. Despite perhaps even the fact that government overreach sometimes produces massive costs and inefficiencies, right? So and I wonder, like, if you think about maybe what the, because we're in this period where we're trying to figure it out, right? And so corporations with purpose are maybe moving a little bit forward, perhaps into the public arena. Governments are reevaluating what they need to do and what collaboration they need to they need to champion. And I just wonder how, let's say, what would you like to believe that say when we have this conference, Brian, in 2031, and we get together the alumni of 2021? Well, what would you like to see after all of that, all of that striving and the potential collaborations and so forth. So think about 2031, 10 years from now. Where would you like to see, let's say, the corporations and governments of the North Atlantic world, how they could collaborate, and what purpose is going to be all about?
So a few angles there too. So I'll do the best I can. So I think the first thing I would say in 2031, which is not that far off when you think about it in general terms, I'd like to think that businesses and corporations are going to realize that there's an impetus to change, to do more, and I hope that they are able to do that, not only because, again, I think is the right thing to do, but also because if not, I'm very worried that governments will feel the pressure, compelled, or maybe cynically see an opportunity and sort of thrust change upon business and corporations, thrust change upon our capitalist economic system, maybe well-intentioned, maybe more for political points. Either way, in that scenario, I worry that it's not going to be good public policy. I worry that it's going to be born out of friction. It's going to be institutions pitted against each other. It's going to be more of a divisive conversation. And look, frankly, this is a very hard, complex. It's all interrelated, and it's important. So that type of conversation merits everybody at the table and everybody sort of being able to not only express themselves but also do so in a bit of a circle of trust, meaning that you can be honest with people what the challenges are and what needs to be addressed, what are the considerations and options. So I'm worried because the challenges that we have right now are very interrelated, and I think from now until 2031 could cause us to have, yes, movement on having business and corporations be purpose driven and stakeholder centric, but in a way in which is friction and which produces, in my humble opinion, not the best public policy. So the challenges we face right now, and don't take my word for it, I had the immense privilege of working on a project with Global Canada, an NGO, where I interviewed 60 C-suite executives in Canada and 30 thought leaders on this topic. And I can tell you that from those interviews, they all identified that climate change, inequality, inequity, the social fabric that is strained at the moment are all major challenges. They would add in Indigenous reconciliation. Some are worried about Canada's place in the world. But if you take those first few ones, they're very interrelated. I mean, if we're going to fight climate change, we need to have some trust with each other. We need to be able to have some honest conversations, which is made a lot tougher because we have a bit of a strained social fabric right now. If we're going to have a stronger social fabric, we need to figure out ways to address inequality and inequity. And if we're going to address inequality and inequity, we need to find ways to, yes, fight climate change, but in a way that is not exacerbating people's maybe financial or economic difficulties. So they're all very interrelated, and unfortunately that makes it all that much tougher. So in 10 years, Lawrence, I do worry that we find ourselves with movement, with changes, but that are born from friction and divisiveness. I hope that we're able to not go that route and really start to think about how can we help business leaders think at the long term? How can we help ensure that we are celebrating the journey and celebrating that there is progress, even though it's not yet perfection? How do we find a way to ensure that governments and business leaders and businesses are working together, that they are a check and balance, sure, but at the same time that there's a clear understanding that if we're going to overcome very complicated societal issues, we need all institutions working together. So I certainly hope it'll be the latter. I'm doing everything I possibly can, including today, to try to inspire the latter. But I'm definitely inclined to think, as of right now, we may find ourselves with the unfortunate sort of former, where people are sort of pitting one against the other and trying to just kind of survive that conversation instead of having a very fruitful one that brings us to where we need to be.
Yes, those are really, really incisive comments, Brian. I very much thank you for them because it's they're real, right? It is not a you know a necessarily a rosy picture. It is not, but it is one that has a great deal of hope to it, right? As we try to figure things out, because after all, business, despite its shadow sides, if you will, makes the stuff we enjoy and consume, right? It also gives us jobs, right? So prosperity and opportunity, as the economist Tyler Cowen has written. Look, we live longer. We have access to the world's online information immediately. The world's online information immediately. We have life-saving pharmaceuticals. We have plentiful food supply, light, heat, power, transportation, and so forth, despite some supply chain issues, recent supply chain issues, right? And so how do, like, I think one of the really the naughty, the Gordian knot, if you will, of purpose is how to balance those forces, those productive forces, if you will, with the obvious need for corporations to do much more than just providing, services and so forth. Those are kind of key competencies and so forth, and you'd expect the pendulum to be right around the center, or more or less. But I think that's something that purpose needs to kind of take on board, and I think it's trying to, because the advocates of purpose are trying to say, look, we need accountability mechanisms that you mentioned before. We need a decent implementation, because it's more of a, let's say, of a whole of society view of how we solve these problems. So you have markets, and you have governments, and you also have, let's say, the social contract, right? And so, and I think one of the things that might be kind of a hopeful sign, in terms of, generally speaking, the corporation itself, is that corporations have been, typically oases of stability and tolerance. They attract and retain talent, not always, not perfectly, but they make it possible for consumers to enjoy more and convenient products, and so forth. And so going to the next stage is, I think, uh, um, it's going to be more. That second stage, I think, will be a little bit more difficult, because you've got all of these kind of counterparties to the, and perhaps even more wicked problems as we become more conscious of those things. So that's less of a question, I think more of a comment, I suppose. But we can, why don't we go back to Mona? I think she has got a couple of questions. If we have time, we have maybe a couple of Q&A remarks from the audience. But let's see if we have the time. But over to you, Mona.
Thanks, Lawrence, and I think it would be great if we could bring in the audience also with a few of their questions. I was really struck, Brian, when you were mentioning about the insight around why people are thinking about leaving employers, and you mentioned, really elements that are the linkage between business and life. these concepts of how my employer views the social issues that matter to me, how I think about work-life balance, how I think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and how my employer does also. And I was just reflecting on this concept of resilience. And if you think about resilience at the individual human level, if we take lessons from high performance and we think about the importance of recovery as part of our individual techniques to build resilience, the ability to recharge, the ability to seek joy by spending time with those we love. These elements of work-life balance aren't just surface issues. They really are issues of resilience, individual resilience. And when you think about inside an organization, how you're setting up the ecosystem around things like flexibility around work, how you think about, is it an always on culture, or is there an opportunity for rest and recovery? With a view of the highest performance, but really embedded in how do you get high performance and the importance of recovery with it. So I really thought that those points that you mentioned, often we'll see them in surveys, and I think people glance by them, but I do think it's at the heart of individual resilience and how organizations and government, as you think about the always on with technology, we talked about technology change being another aspect, so many wonderful things that come from having a super powerful computer at the end of your hand. But one is sometimes that trade-off around rest and recovery in our own habits and behaviors. So that really struck me as aligning well to one of the themes that we really wanted to explore today.
I have to keep jotting down the comments you're both making because it's all so fascinating. And I apologize because I keep rattling off kind of stats and reports and stuff, but I obviously like and appreciate when we can be data driven, right, and not just sort of our guts. So a few comments. So first off, Mona, I have to say you're absolutely right. I was just flabbergasted to what extent when we surveyed Canadians about their experience during the pandemic that we found over 70% of Canadians surveyed said that they changed their life priorities during the pandemic. Almost 3/4 of Canadians admitted to changing their life priorities. And then you ask what changed, and probably no surprise, a lot of things you mentioned already. Family became all that much more important of a value and a priority for Canadians. People's health and very clearly physical and mental health increased immensely in terms of being a priority for Canadians. And what was interesting is work. We had a bit of a net score that we used in the survey. Work was the only ones of all the components that was neutral. It wasn't less of a priority, but it certainly wasn't more of a priority either with that calculation we used. Whereas the other three that I just mentioned skyrocketed. So with that, the idea that people are looking for a business and an employer that's going to put people and profit on the same level, people that are looking for work-life balance, people that are looking for diversity and inclusion in the workplace shouldn't come as a surprise when you really sort of dig in and find out that they all kind of question, which makes sense, right? All of our lives were uprooted, so we kind of question the way we were living, and we say what priorities should change and what should I be sort of maybe adjusting to adapt to this new type of life in the short term, medium term, but also what lessons should I be taking from all this in the long term. I want to also add, interestingly, the Global Canada exercise that I mentioned a while ago, the report's coming out in the coming days, by the way, little teaser there. It was surprising to me, I have to admit, when we asked the participants, 90 overall, 60 C-suite executives, where they were feeling the most pressure to step up and link profit with purpose and be stakeholder centric. I was surprised by the answer because I would have thought that it would have been, customers, right? We're seeing it on social media. We're seeing sort of movements happen when an organization isn't maybe really sort of meeting the expectations and the values of its customers. We see those movements happening. So I personally thought it would be customers, and it wasn't. It was very, very clearly, almost across the board, employers. So C-suite executives were saying, employees. C-suite executives were saying, as employers, we're feeling the most pressure from our employees. That's where it's coming from. And I asked, customers? What about customers? They said, yeah, a little bit, but not as much as employees. Now, the one caveat that they did put to that second question that I asked them on that topic is they did say, we do foresee with generational kind of shifts in priorities that customers will become increasingly the case and that they're going to put more and more pressure. Yes. But right now we're feeling it from our employees, and we also think the generational changes will increase that pressure when it comes to employees. And I just want to, because Lawrence, in your sort of last remarks, I do want to say another piece of data point that we have, because I think it's important. Over 80% of Canadians agree that businesses create wealth, economic opportunity, and innovation, right? So the same people that I've been listing off in terms of their sentiments towards capitalism, societal challenges, the role of business and corporations in tackling them, all acknowledge, I mean, over 80% of them acknowledge the sort of more economic contributions that business and corporations play here in Canada. Nevertheless, that's no longer going to be enough. They do want to see, especially large organizations, do all the things that we've been discussing over the last few minutes. Last 2 points that I'll make really quickly is, as was mentioned, I'm also a senior advisor at Navigator, which is a public affairs firm that did a post-election research in which they had focus groups, and they found that although it may seem, because of the results of the election, the last federal election, that it was sort of an election of nothing, right? People would just say it came with the same results. After doing focus groups to find out why people voted for the Liberal Party, so those that voted for the Liberal Party, the conclusion was that this wasn't about nothing. And in fact, there's a huge appetite for more government intervention. So whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we can put aside for now. Whether it's going to last in the medium to long term, we can put that aside for now. I can tell you that based on the research that we did at the center and this post-election analysis, that there's going to be a huge window for governments to intervene more, mostly born again from the pandemic and the good, I would probably argue, the good that governments had done by intervening. And the last point I'll make, just to put in context, as we have you, Mona, with me on this panel, I was incredibly privileged and lucky to be the Premier of New Brunswick that has approximately 40,000 employees. And Mona, in the role that you play with 45,000 employees, it puts into context how, obviously both institutions are very important, but it puts into context maybe why Canadians are starting to say to themselves, yeah, of course we want the province and governments to step up on this stuff, but we recognize that there are many organizations that can have a significant impact on thousands, if not millions of Canadians and people around the world, so we want them to step up too.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. There's so much that we could go on, especially the last couple of data points, which are, clearly we could go to maybe 10:30 or 11 o'clock, Brian, but we are almost out of time. But I did want to just have one kind of nod to some of the Q&A. So we have one Q&A. We only have a minute or two left, but let me give you this Q&A. We've recently seen that government commitments can wane, like the Paris Accord, as long-term goals, for example, climate, and short-term goals, gas prices, show tension. What can be done to keep all of the stakeholders together, public, government, and businesses? Pretty good question.
I mean, well, yeah, what a fantastic question. I mean, that is the question. Look, the theoretical answer that I would give would be when we can take tough decisions as leaders or members of a community, and we can put them in a long-term perspective, I'm convinced that these difficult choices and decisions become pretty clear. They actually become pretty easy. What makes them difficult is the short-term ramifications, the short-term pressures. So the theoretical answer to your question would be we have to have dialogue and discourse, sort of raising the dialogue and discourse to think about the long-term impacts of these tough decisions. And then the practical one is we need to make sure that businesses are doing everything they can to show that they're stepping up, because that will build trust with the public, which will ultimately build trust with governments. And we need governments to not sort of grab the temptation to jump on the friction and maybe divisiveness that is sort of there right now, and sort of ready for people to jump on, and be leaders and say, no, we're not going to grab that. We're going to instead ensure that we have robust, transparent dialogue, discourse with all of our partners, stakeholders, including business and corporations. If the two institutions could do that, I think we'll be much better placed to have the 2031 that I would like to think we all desire.
Awesome.
I couldn't agree more. Brian, I want to sincerely thank you for joining Lawrence and I this morning, and for sharing your perspectives that are so deeply rooted in the breadth of your experience, and really putting forward an inspiration and a challenge in the nature of your comments that very much were based in facts, but also with a sense of what's possible for the future. So thank you so much.
There's no better way to spend a Friday from my basement here in Shediac Bridge. So thank you very much to both of you and everyone listening.
Thank you very much, Brian.
Fantastic.
We'll have you as a guest again for sure. And I thank you so much for your insights.